Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, January 12th, 2024. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. and the UK bomb Yemen. The U.S. and Britain on Thursday night launched strikes against more than a dozen sites in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen where the majority of Yemenis live, in a move that risks escalating the situation in the Middle East into a major regional war. A U.S. official told CNN that the strikes were launched by fighter jets and Tomahawk missiles fired by warships and submarines, and the U.S. is claiming that they targeted Houthi drone and missile sites and military sites. Yemeni media reported strikes in several cities, including in the capital Sana'a and in the Red Sea port of Hodeidah. President Biden said in a statement that the strikes received support from Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and Bahrain. So that's some coalition that they have there. Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and Bahrain, and the UK. He claimed that the U.S. and Britain, quote, successfully conducted strikes against a number of targets in Yemen used by Houthi rebels to endanger freedom of navigation, end quote. The bombing of Yemen came in response to the Houthi attacks on Israeli-linked commercial shipping in the Red Sea that started in protest of the U.S.-backed Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have vowed not to back down in the face of the U.S. military and said their attacks in the Red Sea will only stop once the Israeli slaughter in Gaza ends. So ahead of the U.S. and British strikes on Yemen, there was reports pretty much all day on Thursday that they were planning this and that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was holding a cabinet meeting where he authorized the strikes. So they knew this was coming, and the Houthis were putting out warnings. And Abdel Malik al-Houthi, who's the group's leader, he said, quote, any American attack will not remain without a response. The response will be greater than the attack that was carried out with 20 drones and a number of missiles, end quote. So far, there have been no reports on the number of casualties caused by the U.S. and British strikes, considering it seemed like these were pretty widespread. I'm sure there were some casualties. Haven't seen anything yet on that. And the U.S. and its allies have a history of killing civilians in Yemen, as the UN estimated in 2021 that about 377,000 people were killed by the U.S.-backed Saudi-UAE war against the Houthis that started in 2015. 377,000 people. And more than half of them died of starvation and disease caused by the blockade and the coalition's brutal bombing campaign. So that war, just to, it's on par with how brutal what Israel is doing in Gaza is, what the Saudis were doing in Yemen with full U.S. support. I mean, the Israeli bombing of Gaza is on a higher scale, like I guess, kind of the number of airstrikes that they're launching. But the Saudis were bombing civilian infrastructure, homes. They were bombing farms, sewage treatment plants, all things like that to really wage war against the civilian population of Yemen. That included the blockade, which is still in force today. It hasn't been fully lifted. It's been eased. The situation is much better right now for the people on the ground in Yemen, but this risks shattering the truce that's been held between the Saudis and the Houthis since April 2022. Although I will say that the Saudis have distanced themselves from the U.S. anti-Houthi activity in the Red Sea. The question is, if they let the U.S. use their airspace to launch strikes on Yemen, I think the Houthis might not be happy about that. But we'll see how it plays out between them. But either way, this thing's going to escalate in some form. And some members of Congress have criticized President Biden for launching the strikes in Yemen without congressional authorization. So I saw this tweet from Ro Khanna. He's a Democrat from California in the House. He said, quote, the president needs to come to Congress before launching a strike against the Houthis in Yemen and involving us in another Middle East conflict. That is Article 1 of the Constitution, end quote. And then before I started recording, I was just scrolling Twitter, and I saw a pretty good amount of members of Congress saying something similar or kind of retweeting what Ro Khanna said and saying that they agree, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side. So it seems like at least some people in Congress are not happy about this strike. And the Houthis have some pretty serious missile capabilities. I think in retaliation, I'm sure they're going to be launching many more than they have been at the commercial vessels if they're going to be really targeting U.S. Warships. All right, so the next one here, we just have a live updates from AlJazeera because they're kind of doing a update thing on the situation both in Yemen and in Gaza. Oh, and the first thing that they have here is in the West Bank. Apparently there's big Israeli raids going on there. Saudi Arabia expresses great concern about Yemen strikes. The Saudis are calling for restraint and avoiding escalation. The Saudis are very worried about their oil fields and their oil infrastructure again being targeted by Houthi missile and drones. That's one big reason why they decided to negotiate a peace deal with the Houthis, was because they got very good at hitting the Saudis. And that's an important point to make too. All that brutal bombing campaign that the Saudis and the UAE and the US launched against the Houthis didn't do anything. It only made them stronger, the Houthis. The civilians suffered on the ground, but the Houthis just got better missiles and drones. So, if they just think bombing the Houthis is going to end this, they're definitely mistaken. So another update here, the Houthis tell aggressor countries and their supporters in the region to expect a response. And they're saying that this includes when they're talking about aggressor countries and their supporters, they're talking about countries that open their airspace for these strikes, which could potentially be Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure. So again, we'll see how the Houthis react exactly. All right, so the next one here, Iran seizes a tanker in retaliation for the U.S. stealing its oil. So Iran seized an American tanker in the Gulf of Oman on Thursday in retaliation for the U.S. previously seizing the same tanker and stealing a shipment of Iranian oil that it was carrying. So back in April 2023, the U.S. forced the tanker, which was formerly named Suez Rajan, to sail to Texas when it was carrying 800,000 barrels of Iranian oil using the pretext of sanctions enforcement. If you remember, I covered this quite a bit. The ship sat off the coast of Texas for months as Iran was warning of retaliation if it was discharged, and American companies didn't want anything to do with it. They were worried about their ships, being seized in the Persian Gulf. But the oil, which was worth approximately $56 million, was eventually transferred to another tanker in August 2023. So I'm just going to read this excerpt. This is from an Iranian media report on this latest seizure. It says, quote, following the violation of the Suez Rajan in April and the theft of Iranian oil by the United States, the oil tanker renamed St. Nicholas was seized in retaliation this morning by the court order and approval of the Ports and Shipping Organization by the Strategic Navy of the Islamic Republic of Iran and transferred to Iranian ports, end quote. The report said that the tanker was taken because it has stolen cargo belonging to Iran, because it had stolen cargo that was belonging to Iran at the direction of the U.S., and the ship, which is now named the St. Nicholas, was seized after it was loaded with oil in Basra, Iraq, and it was bound for Turkey via the Suez Canal. So the U.S. has a history of seizing tankers carrying Iranian oil and gas and outright stealing the cargo by selling it off for profit. And Iran has previously seized tankers in retaliation for the actions. I list a few examples here. One in 2021, the U.S. sold off 2 million barrels of Iranian oil that it took off a tanker. In 2022, the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in Greece and attempted to take the cargo, but a Greek court ruled against the confiscation. Back during the Trump administration, the U.S. seized a few tankers that were headed for Venezuela carrying gas, and they were discharged and sold off. So, but this is another thing, so you have Iran seize this ship, and the U.S. came out with, saying that, they might respond or something. So who knows where that could go. There's just so many different things going on that it's just, a recipe for disaster, and it's all for Israel. The U.S. bombed Yemen. The U.S. has been bombing Syria and Iraq because of its support for Israel. So the next one here, Israel killed 2 medics in attack on southern Lebanon. This article is from Jason Ditz. Israeli military strikes in southern Lebanon continued on Thursday, with reports that a flurry of strikes in Hanan struck a first aid clinic, killing 2 medics who were within. The Lebanese health ministry confirmed and condemned the strikes, adding that the Israelis also hit an ambulance. The Israeli statement on the attack confirmed that they launched an attack, but they did not. They claimed that they targeted terrorist infrastructure. And then there was a new threat from the Israeli military. Israeli Army Chief Herzi Halevi bragged about the destructive capabilities of the Israeli military that it has deployed in Gaza, saying that to the soldiers, quote, "There is no village in Lebanon that you cannot enter and destroy," end quote. So more of that threatening rhetoric about Lebanon. All right, so the next one here, South Africa presents Israel genocide case at the International Court of Justice. So this was the big news of the day. There's a big hearing. It's almost like the U.S. bombed Yemen to get this out of the news cycle or something. Because if you watch this hearing, I didn't watch the whole thing. It's over 3 hours. I watched a pretty good amount of it, but I just didn't have the time. But, it's a very strong case. And, the things that they talk about, and I'll cover some of it here. So, anyway, let me just read this article here. South African officials and lawyers on Thursday made their case at the International Court of Justice in The Hague to show that Israel's committing genocide against the Palestinian population of Gaza. The over 3-hour hearing was an indictment of the U.S.-backed Israeli campaign in Gaza, which has killed over 23,000 Palestinians, mainly women and children, in just over 3 months. South Africa said Israel breached the Genocide Convention of 1948, which Israel is a signatory to that convention, and that is what South Africa invoked to bring this case to the ICJ. Article 2 of the convention defines genocide as, quote, "a crime committed with the intent to destroy a nation, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part," end quote. Referencing the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, South African Justice Minister Ronald Lamola said, quote, "No armed attack on a state territory, no matter how serious, even an attack involving atrocity crimes, can provide justification for or defense to breaches to the convention, whether it's a matter of law or morality," end quote. So South Africa referenced Israel's brutal bombing campaign and siege tactics to demonstrate that its actions are genocidal. This is from Adila Hassam. She was a lawyer representing South Africa at the hearing, and she said, quote, "For the past 96 days, Israel has subjected Gaza to what has been described as one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. Palestinians in Gaza are being killed by Israeli weaponry and bombs from air, land, and sea. They are also at immediate risk of dying by starvation, dehydration, and disease as a result of the ongoing siege. The level of Israel's killing is so extensive that nowhere is safe in Gaza," end quote. So to prove that Israel is committing genocide, South Africa needs to demonstrate that Israeli officials have the intent to do so. South Africa pointed to the genocidal rhetoric from Israeli officials, which there has not been a shortage of. And, it's been common since October 7th, especially among members of the Israeli Knesset. But one quote that they put in here is from Netanyahu when he referenced the Bible story about the nation of Amalek. So Netanyahu said in October, he said, quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our holy Bible. And we do remember, and we are fighting," end quote. So the Bible verse about this, chapter 15, verse 3 of 1 Samuel, the book 1 Samuel, reads, quote, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and women, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass," end quote. So that's what Netanyahu was referencing in that speech. So the ruling on whether or not Israel is committing genocide could take years, but South Africa is asking the ICJ to immediately order a halt to the Israeli military operations. So Friday is Israel's chance to defend itself. And then from what I understand, in a few weeks or so, then the court's going to decide on the order to halt military operations. The decision on genocide could take years, but to halt the military operations could happen in the coming weeks. So we'll see what Israel's defense is. If their response to this hearing is any indication, they're not going to have a good one. Israeli officials responded to Thursday's hearing by accusing South Africa of being the legal arm of Hamas. Of course, kind of their typical smear to anybody who speaks out against what they're doing in Gaza is, oh, you're Hamas supporter, you must love Hamas. So we'll see how their defense is in the next hearing. All right, so the next one here, DeSantis, that's Ron DeSantis, does not oppose Israel's ethnic cleansing of Gaza. This article is from Kyle Anselon at the Libertarian Institute, and it's about the GOP debate that happened the other night that I didn't even know happened. I've been just not paying attention to this presidential race at all. So anyway, during the latest GOP debate, Governor Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley argued which candidate would give more support to Israel. DeSantis pledged to support Israel even if it conducts an ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Haley said that she has a record of fighting for Tel Aviv. Moderator Jake Tapper asked the Florida governor, I'll just read how Tapper put the question. He said, quote, "Some Israeli cabinet officials are pushing for the mass removal of Palestinians from Gaza. Governor Haley told CNN last week she does not support that. Do you?" End quote. And then this is DeSantis's response. He said, quote, "We've got to support Israel in word and in deed, in public and in private. And they've got to be able to finish the job. I think to be a good ally, you back them in the decisions that they're making with respect to Gaza. But for us to be sitting in Washington second-guessing them, I don't think that's the right way." End quote. When asked for clarity, DeSantis explained further, quote, "As president, I am not going to tell them to do that. I think there's a lot of issues with that, but if they make the calculation that to avert a second Holocaust, I think some of these Palestinian Arabs, Saudi Arabia should take some, Egypt should take some," end quote. So he basically comes out in support of that idea. DeSantis really is one of the worst, like pro-Israel Zionist American politicians. He goes to Israel to hold like Florida cabinet meetings. He signed legislation in Israel. So this isn't really a surprise, but it goes to show, I mean, I don't think DeSantis really has much of a chance based on the polls, but it goes to show how, I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody being worse than Biden is right now on Gaza, but it goes to show that the Republican, whoever comes in, if a Republican wins and comes in and next year, they're probably going to just let Israel do whatever they want. All right. And another thing, so Nikki Haley was at the UN. She was Trump's ambassador to the UN, and DeSantis went after Nikki Haley for saying that she supported the idea of a two-state solution. DeSantis said, "No two-state solution, no state for the Palestinians." I know he said that there's no occupation of the West Bank before. I've seen him say that. So again, he's one of the most strident Israel defenders that there is. All right, so the next one here, Israeli army ordered a mass Hannibal directive on October 7th. So this article is from The Cradle, but it cites a report in an Israeli newspaper, Yehidath Aronoth. I always pronounce that wrong probably, but it's a pretty well-read Israeli newspaper. And they had this report that said the Israeli military implemented the Hannibal directive during the Hamas attack on October 7th, killing some of its own civilians and soldiers to prevent Hamas from taking them as captive back to Gaza, according to an investigation by this paper. So the Hebrew edition of the paper wrote on January 11th that, quote, "One of the revelations revealed in the investigation is that at midnight on October 7th, the IDF ordered all of its combat units in practice to use the Hannibal procedure, although without clearly mentioning this explicitly by name," end quote. The order was to stop at all costs any attempt by Hamas terrorists to get into Gaza, basically even if you have to kill Israelis. And that's the Hannibal directive, is this secret Israeli military directive that basically says, if a IDF soldier is being taken hostage, do everything you can to prevent it, even if that means killing the soldier. And there's been a lot of evidence that they use this to procedure or directive, whatever you call it, in the response to the October 7th attack. And we've seen other media outlets cover the civilian casualties caused by Israeli fire. There was the tank fire on the kibbutz. But this is saying that when the Hamas militants were taking Israelis back to Gaza, that they were just killing them and just firing on them and whoever they were with. And the Haaretz. Oh, sorry. This is Times of Israel. This is how Israeli media describes the Hannibal directive. It allows soldiers to use potentially massive amounts of force to prevent a soldier from falling into the hands of enemies. This includes the possibility of endangering the life of the soldier in question in order to prevent his capture. All right. So the next one here, the U.S. did not track over $1 billion worth of arms to Ukraine. So more than $1 billion in weapons that were shipped to Ukraine have not been properly tracked by the Pentagon. A report from the Defense Department's Inspector General has found. The report examined $1.699 billion in weapons sent to Ukraine that are subject to enhanced end-use monitoring, which includes Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, night vision goggles, other types of weapons, certain types of missiles. It's basically smaller, more portable things that can be smuggled easily and sent out to the black market. They're supposed to have more tracking of these types of weapons. So if you look at the numbers here, we're only talking about $1 billion worth of weapons, but considering how much the U.S. has sent, that might not sound like much. But this is just examining basically $1.7 billion in weapons that they sent. And they found that the majority of it, $1.005 billion, was not tracked, was not accounted for after it was sent to Ukraine. And this was nearly 40,000 weapons. So, there has been this whole policy of just dumping weapons into Ukraine has been done with very little oversight. And the number here of weapons that they examined is just a small fraction of the over $40 billion in weapons that the U.S. has either sent to Ukraine or promised that they'll give Ukraine in the future. It's just another indication. And there's been efforts to establish a Inspector General for Ukraine, but those have been voted down. All right, so the next one here. White House backs using frozen Russian funds to spend on Ukraine. So Bloomberg reported that the White House has thrown its support behind legislation that's been introduced in Congress that would allow the use of frozen Russian central bank assets to fund Ukraine. So about $300 billion in Russian central bank assets was frozen by the U.S. and its allies after Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022. The idea of outright stealing the money and giving it to Ukraine has been floated for a while, but the Biden administration has hesitated over the legality of the issue. U.S. officials have also been concerned that spending the Russian funds could make other countries hesitant to keep funds in dollars or at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and that would speed up global de-dollarization. But according to Bloomberg, the White House National Security Council said that it welcomed, in principle, the legislation introduced in Congress to seize the funds. So the NSC, the White House, says it's good. And House Speaker Mike Johnson has also come out in favor of the plan. So he said this back in November. I wasn't aware of this. He said, quote, "It would be pure poetry to fund the Ukrainian war effort with Russian assets." As you can imagine, that idea has been met with great enthusiasm on the Republican side. I suspect it will be with our colleagues on the other side as well. It's an eminently responsible thing for us to do, end quote. So he's saying it's so responsible. We got to do it. Let's go. And, you talk about going back to the story I covered earlier, what happens when the U.S. does these unilateral moves and just takes things from other countries? It creates more conflict around the world when you see Iran seizing tankers in response to the U.S. taking its oil. Who knows how Russia might respond to this. And again, just the precedent that's going to be set here, it's going to make more countries cautious about where they keep their money. And so this bill that was introduced, it's been introduced in both chambers of Congress, and it would give the executive branch the authority to establish a Ukraine support fund using stolen Russian funds. The bill has 14 bipartisan co-sponsors in the Senate and 62 in the House. So it has a lot of support. And, they focus on reconstruction. They say that this money could be used to fund reconstruction. But the bill, the language, it's very open-ended. Basically, it says it could support any purposes which support the recovery of Ukraine and the welfare of the Ukrainian people. So that can be stretched into many different ways. So news of the White House support for the legislation comes as the Biden administration is struggling to get the over $60 billion in funding for the proxy war in Ukraine that it's asked for from Congress. Republicans are still holding out for the border deal. And there's about $300 billion of Russian central bank funds are frozen by the U.S., by the West. About $67 billion of that is in the U.S., and the vast majority, $200 billion, is in Europe. And according to this Bloomberg report, it's still unclear if the EU is going to go along with this plan. I have a feeling that the U.S. could convince them if they want to put the screws on them. All right, so the last one here. China official meets Biden aide to explain Taiwan red line. So this is an article from the South China Morning Post, and a Chinese official, the head of the international liaison for China's Communist Party, visited the U.S., and he's the highest-ranking Chinese official to visit the U.S. since the Xi-Biden summit. And he met with the Deputy National Security Advisor, John Feiner, and they discussed some things, including Taiwan. And the wording was interesting. Now, this is something that President Xi has said to President Biden in meetings, basically saying that we need to establish our red lines and that Taiwan is the first red line that must not be crossed. That Taiwan is the biggest issue, our biggest thing. But the U.S. does not seem too concerned about that. So this Chinese official said, quote, "For China, the Taiwan question is at the very core of the interests. It's the red line that must never be crossed," end quote. So now this comes a few days before the elections in Taiwan, which are being held on Saturday. So we're going to find out after this weekend. I'm not sure how long it'll take for the results, but we'll probably have at least a good idea in the next show. And that's going to be a big pivotal election. It could be. The polling shows the Kuomintang pretty close to the DPP right now. And if the Kuomintang wins, that would be a big upset for the plans that the U.S. has for Taiwan, because they want to mend ties with China. So at least have friendlier ties with China, ease tensions with China. So we'll see what happens after the weekend. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Gareth Porter, South Africa's proof of Israel's genocide in Gaza. One from Joshua Frank, the killing of Gaza's environment. One from Jonathan Cook, the West will stand in the dock alongside Israel at the genocide court. One from Daniel Larison, how did Blinken avoid the atrocity famine in Gaza? And one from Ben Six Smith, we should oppose voluntary resettlement out of Gaza. So that's everything for me for this week. We'll see what happens. I mean, the next few hours, a lot could happen if the Houthis start retaliating. Who knows how things could spiral out of control, but I'll get you all caught up after the weekend. Hopefully it doesn't get too bad. But you could always support this show by sharing, telling your friends about antiwar.com, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Follow us on Twitter, both antiwar.com, and you can follow me on there at DeCampDave. I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. Thanks for listening.